Hi, Johan.
Hello, Vasilina. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. And I'm glad we have this space.
Same here, definitely. Um, I must say, when I first saw your account, it's always hard for someone who doesn't speak any, who's not from Eastern Europe, from any country where they have. It's hard to distinguish between Ukrainian, Bulgarian, Russian, other countries as well. It's hard to distinguish who is from which country. But when I
Mhm.
found out that you were a Russian person who had changed their mind, and you basically, when I read your tweets, you basically sound like Gary Kasparov. I was intrigued, I have to say, because especially given that you've grown up in Russia, I thought you were a very fascinating character because I'm when I think about the kind of perception of Russian opposition in the pro-Ukrainian spaces, it's not one that's positive because yeah. So when I heard, when I read your tweets, I'm like, wow, she really sounds like sort of Gary Kasparov, and I think that's a compliment, definitely. So I was very fascinating to just find out who you are and how you've gotten to where you are now. And that's kind of how this conversation also started.
Right. Thank you so much, Johan. I really appreciate you pointing out that for an outside observer who is less familiar with the region and its convoluted history, the identities of people are very difficult to distinguish. And I kind of resisted for a long time the idea that I need to put in my Twitter profile the information that I was born in Russia and I grew up there because, you generally want to kind of shed that kind of context to be able to be perceived, I guess, without this unnecessary context. And in general, for me, it's like in Russia, we need to carry passports around to to show to the law enforcement that we have the right to be there. Let's say, for example, right? So I really didn't want to carry my passport around me with me around the web, but I did come to the
Mm.
conclusion that it's necessary for me to explain that I'm coming from Russia. And I think there is a part of Russian opposition that, as you mentioned, Kasparov, of course, he's maybe one of the most prominent ones who take on a clear pro-Ukrainian position, even if some of this position might be perceived as not um, it's not going to be endorsed by a lot of, let's say, fractions, right? Not only from the Russian opposition itself, but from the Ukrainian society as well. I totally understand how Ukrainians might reject any sort of Russian voices anywhere, and they have every right to do that. But I also have my own connections to Ukraine, and I'm not willing to discount or dismiss those connections. I actually have relatives who are telling me that they are proud of me, who live in Ukraine. And so for me, I'm leading my conversation with my friends, with people who know me, with my relatives in Ukraine. So I feel like I carved for myself some sort of space where I actually am comfortable.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, obviously. I mean, it's hard to, when I read your tweets, it's hard to distinguish whether you're Ukrainian or just very pro. I mean, for someone who has grown up in Russia and to sort of, like you used the word shed before. I mean, to me, someone who has shed the parts of things that are also associated with Russia completely off and sound basically just it's hard to know whether if I didn't know anything about you, I thought you were Ukrainian basically. from the way you express yourself and everything. It's yeah, and I also appreciate the things you say. You, it's hard to put words into it, but you point out things that that I appreciate. It's thoughtful things, and I think you should have more followers than you have. And I think that there will be a day when you will have more followers, if that's something you actually would want to have, because I think you're one of those people that people can listen to, and I think also on a bigger scale, because you say a lot of interesting things, for sure.
Thank you, Johan. I really appreciate hearing that. I have heard that even from Russians, that some of them perceive me as Ukrainian, and I understand. However, I also think that if they kind of had the imprint from the war, being in a different informational space than they were, let's say, not within Russian contexts, whether they were in Russia or they were abroad, but kind of exposed to Ukrainian context early on, they would also be able to understand the position from which Ukrainians are coming from. And I also heard before that I need to have more followers or something, and I'm here to say that I actually had a semi-anonymous account that was followed much better than my main accounts, but I kind of lost interest in doing it. I feel like it's important, if you want to have more followers, to understand that you need to speak not only to your circle, but to broader audience. You have to formulate your things in a way that speak directly to the broader audience. And I personally don't always have interest in this. And I feel like I speak to the audience that is small, and I'm comfortable doing it. I'm kind of less comfortable speaking to a broader audience. And again, I had that experiment running for about 2 years, and I abandoned it. I just didn't have much interest in it.
Yeah, I hear you, but what I think first, you're a psychologist. You've also done anthropology. Those things are very interesting for understanding the Russian people. You have insight into that. You have insight into, I think it is trauma, correct? Yeah. So
Yeah.
I mean, and both things I would say are pretty niche areas. That you, also having grown up in Russia and then moved away from there because you could no longer do your studies there and everything. I think that, I certainly think that there is room for someone like you in these spaces, because I think the question I have, and I'm sure a lot of other people have, is just what explains the Russian mentality? What explains why there is so little pushback in Russia? And if you compare it to a country like Iran, where they don't like the government, as I'm sure people do in Russia also, they don't like the government, but there seems to be some kind of just, they don't do anything about it. Whereas the Iranian people, they rally to the streets and they die in their thousands. I'm not suggesting that, I'm not sure what means that, why more Russians aren't protesting, whereas the Iranians are. Do you have any kind of? I mean, I'm not sure what you know about the Iranians, but you can at least speak about the Russians, because that's one of the things that I was really interested about you, is what explains this basically, and is there anything from your as a working as a scientist in anthropology in these regions of Siberia that can give you some kind of understanding of this? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's a great question. Yeah, I appreciate you asking it. And indeed, I don't really know a lot about Iran, and I don't speak the languages that they're spoken in the region, and I haven't studied it professionally, so I cannot really delve much into it. But I did study Russia professionally as the specific society of mostly Russians in Siberia. And of course, I lived in Russia for a long time, and I still maintain connections with Russia. So I actually left Russia long before the war started, even before 2014. But I did continue my studies there until 2019, which was the year of pandemic. And I have not been there since. And I lost the ability to return to my field because I began speaking against the war on social media, which is not much, but that's the kind of small platform that was accessible to me. So I was using the one that I had. So after I lost my access to the field as an anthropologist, I retrained as a psychotherapist. And yes, I think that a lot of what is going on in terms of the war is a trauma. It's resentment or resentment, if we were to use Nietzsche's term, right? It's this accumulated resentment towards the world in general within Russians. I don't feel like there is a good justification for it. Although I constantly hear from my Russian friends that we were not as welcomed in the West, and so on and so on. I don't think there is any standing to it. I feel like Russians were always accepted and welcomed everywhere. I really don't believe there was much space, at least I guess in the US, where you would be somehow called out unpleasantly for being Russian or something like that. So the question that you ask, however, is the most interesting one. Why are Russians not coming against their own government in on such scale as people do in Iran, right? And I feel like there is a number of factors. One factor is, first of all, Putin's regime has been successful in squenching, kind of squeezing out of the country and suppressing opposition in a way that has had a certain history to it. So the last truly mass protests in Russia were in the winter of 2011, 2012. And that protest was kind of allowed to happen, meaning it was a controlled, I guess, possibility for people to exhaust a certain protest moods and protest feelings, like they were allowed to protest for days during that winter. And after they were allowed to do it in this controlled manner, this protest died down. And of course, a lot of leaders suffered, and some were kind of caught, and some were going abroad eventually. Some were given like sentences, but they were usually given sentences not based on any political ideas or persecutions. They were given those sentences on administrative, supposedly economic charges, something like that. They were criminalized in a different manner by the state. So that was very smart, because it's one thing if you are persecuted for a political stance, and it's quite another if you are labeled, let's say, somebody who is doing economic crimes, right? And so that was one stage. But that of course doesn't explain why are these protests not happening now? I mean, to be fair, there was a little bit of protest in 2022, and there are still protests in the sense that we see, for example, young people blowing up some keys of infrastructure, some like points of infrastructure, right? We see the growing list of extremists and terrorists in Russia, which are these are purely political, lists. So there is this oppression from one point, but from the other point, I think what is happening. I'm sorry, I'm talking very long now, but from the other point, I think that this war is really popular in Russia. I think people genuinely either support it actively or they have this mindset of my country is not right, but it's my country. I cannot, speak against it. A lot of people in Russia evidently think that the war is going in the right direction or that it's going satisfactorily. So yeah, I think it's just a popular war in Russia, basically. So there is this suppression and there is this popularity. I feel like Putin's regime is a populist regime, and it's very attuned and attentive to the sound of, to the voices of the opposition as well. But yeah, it's popular.
So you said that the protests, they allowed the protests in 2011, 2012. So my question then is, they allow it, but is it some kind of experiment to see if they can control it, contain it? Because I don't think they're doing it because they are giving their citizens more rights. So I'm thinking it has some more kind of purpose, kind of the same thing that they did fairly recently when they cut off the internet in, I think it was Moscow and St. Petersburg, that they're experimenting in some ways where they're testing to see how the population reacts and how much they can do something. If something were to happen, how can we deal with it? Do you think there's some truth to that, or is it just some speculation that am I just speculating?
I think you are right. I think you are right. I think we do see in Russia, despite all these oppressions, right, and repressions of these different opinions, we do see in Russia that some people are allowed to voice the opinions of a certain spectrum of society, certain part of the spectrum, right? For example, Nadezhdin, who only recently, Boris Nadezhdin, Russian oppositionist, who only recently had to leave Russia. He was allowed to a degree to kind of gain certain political weight, and only recently, when there was this discourse about re-election for the State Duma, he was basically given some charges, which spelled out that he will be imprisoned. So he had to leave the country. And recently, again, we see the party called Yabloko, which is apple in English, created a while ago by some of the leaders, including Yavlinsky. And now one of the leaders of the party is Nikolai Rybakov. And the program of the party is that we want peace. I was actually corrected on social media by one of the representatives of the party when I said that they are going for the Duma with the slogan "No to War." Even though this slogan is also party line, but it was a party line in 2022. And now their slogan is "We are for the peace." We are for the peace. So apparently, being for the peace does not necessitate no to war, but they're of course trying to kind of carve for themselves that space where they can legally talk about against the war in Russia. But I don't think that their calculation is correct. I think that even if they are allowed to compete for the Duma places to become deputies or whatever it's called, representative would probably be a good word, a deputat, it will be in Russian. Even if they're allowed to compete, they would probably lose, meaning not gain 5% that is necessary to get into Duma. And after that, a new wave of repression is, of course, totally reasonable to expect when everybody who is active is going to be branded as foreign agents, as I was, for example, right? Or terrorists, extremists, hinted that they have to leave the country or imprisoned. And some of the activists of Yabloko are actually political prisoners right now, I believe. Yeah, there is some allowance of speaking some of these things that are less jarring to the state, supposedly, right? We are for the peace, for example, right? And I feel like, yeah, it's done in a controlled manner. Like it's not really presenting any challenge to the regime. It's not going to create any difficulties in the political discourse. And it's also a display for the world that, see, we have a democracy. It's just that
Yeah.
very few people support peace. Yeah.
Yeah, that is true. One of the more interesting things that I read was from this American publication called Huffington Post. They posted an article many years ago now, where it talked about using the protest. It was about Russia. I'm not sure exactly what it was, but it's basically from their I don't remember. They used to publish once a year the the Russian state's goals or something like that, what they are trying to achieve inside of Russia and outside. And one of the things that they are scared of themselves, but which they are also pushing in the West, is trying to use the protest potential of a population, trying to get people to go out on the street in Western countries that are democratic, so that people will go out and protest their government to cause division. In 2018 or 2000, I think it was 2018, there was a guy in Sweden. He came initially. He said he was a gay man. He sought permanent residence here and everything, Swedish citizenship, but he didn't get it. But then he came back under a different name, and then what he kept doing inside of Sweden is writing under different names and taking a anti-immigration view, and then taking a pro-immigration view. And this is sort of causing division, trying to get people to start protesting. So you see a lot of this. So and this kind of so I think you're onto something there. I think that they are trying to portray themselves as democratic, that they have elections and all that, and they are at least as fair as in the Western world, if not more, because look at they'll point to anything, obfuscate, and just invent some complete falsehood about what's going on. But it's so much to portray themselves as that in the eyes of the Western audience. And yeah, like I said, the protest potential. But then I think there is because they are not democratically elected, they are also scared of the population actually protesting. So it seems to me, and you know this even better than me, but it seemed that when Navalny started getting more traction in Russia, that's when they started cracking down on him and poisoning him and all of that, because he's seen as a threat, and then they have to crack down. I mean, I don't even understand how these laws work in Russia. It seems to me that they can basically invent any kind of charges against anyone. Everything that is talked about in the United States, where the courts are supposed to be politicized, that is exactly what's happening in Russia, in my view. And it's scary to me how there are people in the West that actually believe in what the Russians are saying about any of this, because if you have any kind of knowledge about the situation, you realize that this is just so far from the truth. And anything that they accuse the West of, whether it's going into other countries' politics or something. That's exactly what they're doing. And yeah, sorry, I was a little bit over the place there, but yeah,
No,
there's.
it's all very reasonable. It's very understandable, and it's fascinating to me to hear your perspective on these things. I'm fascinated by this character who would come and write from opposite directions about this hot topic of immigration right now. It's really fascinating. I feel like a lot of people don't understand that Russia is actually a very legalistic society, and it could be very jarring to hear, I'm sure. But the thing is, these laws that, especially in the last several years, the State Duma was churning out as this mad printer, getting more and more laws. They describe a completely different alternative legal reality. And ever since the inclusion of the Ukrainian four oblasts in the Russian constitution for oblasts and Crimea, right? It's Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Luhansk
Mhm.
oblasts. This inclusion, this legal inclusion in the constitution already creates this skewed reality that is proclaimed by the Russians to have a primacy or supremacy over the Western body of the law. And so these accusations that are being made within Russia and on the occupied territories of Ukraine, for example, where they have this travesty practice when they, apprehend somebody who is a Ukrainian patriot, or sometimes maybe even just somebody who was sending money to the relatives in Ukraine, for example, right, in the unoccupied part, or like had any sort of communication. For example, they apprehend these people, right? They charge them with treason. So the idea is that these people betrayed Russia while living in Ukraine, and this is all done in accordance to the law, but this law is just a totally lawless law. And the same is happening with how you becoming, for example, a foreign agent, let's say in Russia, for example. You can be charged, like I was charged, for speaking against the special military operation, so-called, which is this full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine of 2022 that is ongoing.
Yeah.
So it is criminalized. Like, we are accused not because these people are lawless. We are accused in accordance with their laws. But their law is, of course, in contrast with common sense, the international law, some sort of understanding of truth, morals, and so on and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fascinating. But there's one thing that I wanted to ask you, and I probably should have asked you that question to begin with, actually. But going back to that, so you said you moved to, was it the United States before 2014?
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay. And so you grew up in Russia. What were your thoughts about the Western world, about Ukraine growing up? Did you have any thoughts in particular? What did you think about the Russian government? I'm just very curious to hear that.
Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate your question. Well, I was born in the Soviet Union in
Hmm.
1979. So I was 11 when the Soviet Union collapsed. And so the Russian state, which emerged in place, in me, it already kind of did not quite generate that same sense of patriotism that was generated in all of us during our childhood years, like in kindergarten and school, towards the state that no longer existed. Like, it's very hard to experience the same level of excitement, patriotic excitement, towards a completely different state. But Nevertheless, I've always had been very patriotic person, and kind of also experienced a lot of nostalgia for the Soviet times. But I did also have exposure to Ukraine, not in tales, but rather in reality, because um, I've visited Ukraine every year growing up and spent there all summer. And of course, the summer vacation Ukraine is not at all the real Ukraine, right? I was living with my grandmother and my grandfather, both of whom were born in Ukraine and are buried there. And talking to my brother and my sister there, who were just like my own brother to me, so very close ties, and loved that place, tremendously loved that place. I was writing this, my first novel about Ukraine the way I knew it. It was like sort of the autofiction, which again, something that I love. The genre is, I think, amazing, where this picture of the Ukrainian village was flipping into the picture of the student living, young woman living in Moscow, attending Moscow State University, and all the excitement that is associated with it, with the future that is opening up. And so this love to the village where I spend so much time, it has been very personal to me. And when I'm thinking about patriotism, I have a lot of allegiance to this village as opposed to Moscow, because I always kind of felt that I'm just one of the many people in Moscow, whereas in that village, for example, I really felt some sort of connection to people, to my relatives, my grandmother, things like that. So I'm one of this generation that was born in the Soviet Union, and that's one of the reasons why I'm perceiving this war in a lot of ways as a continuation of the collapse of the Soviet Union, or rather, continuation of the Russian imperial project. Because it's an attempt to resubjugate that colony that was under Moscow during some period of time, right? And that suddenly became its own state.
Oh yeah. So, in other words, you were on vacations as a child or as a teenager, or was it?
Yeah, throughout my whole, life in Russia, I
Okay.
traveled every summer.
Okay. All right. So, but so in other words, you had seen basically what the Soviet Union used to say about Ukraine, you've seen about what Russia has said about Ukraine. Did you have any particular views on the sort of the Western world? And what was your thoughts on that at the time? And did it evolve in any kind of way
Yeah,
throughout time?
yeah, I appreciate it, Johan. I do appreciate it. It's a great question. Yeah, so as many people coming from my region, I shared a lot of preconceptions about the West. And I sort of went into the West to live there for a while. It was not a plan that I will stay for any extended period of time, at least not eventually, not like, immediately. Like, let's say, even before the full-blown invasion, I was considering that after I'm done with some of my projects here, which, are mostly personal, I will be returning to Russia. And it's a completely reasonable and it's an okay trajectory, and a lot of people do it. They leave their country, they go live somewhere, they live there for maybe even 20 years, and they return, right? And nobody bats an eye or thinks 2 times about it. But in the West, I definitely, at least in the US, I definitely began looking at things a lot in different ways, and one of these different ways is that the West is not a monolith, right? There is a lot of movements in the West, and for example, a lot of Russians going out of Russia, they align very well with republicanism and with the right movements, right? There is this whole anti-immigrant sentiment, or like this sentiment, the shared sentiment that the war, like the white race is extinguishing or anything like that. But there is also the movement that is ready for the Russians that is on the left. Let's say there is a harsh critique of capitalism from the communist positions, right? And a lot of this critique I personally was exposed to in the University of Texas at Austin, where I received my PhD in anthropology. So it's not a one size fits all. The West is very big and vast and has different movements, and in to each of these movements we can formulate our own opinion.
Mm. Um, what would you say? How would you characterize the views in Russia? Are they also are they? Would you say they? I'm assuming they are not monolith either, but what would you say sort of the difference then? Um, yeah, what would you say? Yeah, do you understand my question? Or
Yeah, yeah, it's
yeah.
it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question. Well, I feel that in Russia, there is a lot of support for the Russian Empire, right? Even though it's not framed this way, it's usually framed that everybody is joining us voluntarily, and we are this civilizational project that can offer something to the world in general. And this civilizational project is something that we can uphold regardless of political affiliations. So basically, the ideology of colonialism supersedes various other ideologies within Russia.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, I get it. But so, hmm. So you said that the West wasn't monolithic, but did the experience living in the United States change your view of Russia? And also, at what point did you start? Did you at some point start seeing things in Russia that you didn't like, or did you just ignore it, or did you see the repression? I'm just curious how things have evolved over time, basically.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate this question. Yeah, so of course, my view of Russia changed a lot because I was exposed not just to the Western context, but also to the socio-cultural anthropology program in the US, because it's entirely possible to move to the West and to save all the allegiances that you have ever had to your country, including for Russians. It's very easy, and more often, the programs abroad also don't undo it by themselves, right? So, for example, my PhD thesis was about more Siberian everyday affect, which is like in anthropology, there is this idea that there is something that is underlying our daily feelings. For example, a lot of people suggested that the daily affect in the post-Soviet Russia was Soviet nostalgia, which is entirely true. However, I also found there the affect that I call cheerful nonchalance, which means that people are kind of accepting the difficulties of daily lives with this kind of blasé attitude, with the attitude of it doesn't matter, we will overcome everything. And this attitude, by the way, helped Russians to overcome, at least morally, those sanctions that were imposed on them, right? The overall attitude was it's whatever, we can deal with whatever, it's no big deal. And it was a dominant attitude. So, up until the full blown invasion, of course, I did have the reevaluation of things in regard to, for example, the period of Stalinism in Russia, which I wasn't really exposed in school to this knowledge, but later on I realized that how systematic repressions were, the movement of the whole masses of people based on the ethnicity, the deportation, the ethnic deportations, right? But overall, I must say, up until 2022, the full-blown invasion of Ukraine, I really pretty much espoused this more normative, I think, identity of a Russian in the West. And, in particular, Russian who wants to be in academia, let's say, for example, of basically not only describing the Soviet nostalgia, but also indulging in it. I had this book written, still manuscript, but I'm hoping to return to it eventually, but I don't know how now after this war, which was called Debris of Utopia, where I'm looking attentively at my memories from childhood. Surrounding the Soviet day-to-day life that I was exposed to. And of course, when you're looking at your own childhood, even if you understand as an adult that there is a huge context to it where people really suffered from the Soviet regime, you still kind of feel this attachment to this previous, daily features of daily life. And so I must say that before 2022, of course, I knew that these things are happening, but I think much as many other Russian liberals, I guess, which is not I'm not trying to give myself that permission. I'm just kind of trying to look at it as an observer. And as an observer, I say that these things appeared to be like I guess the late reactions of the Putin's regime that was perceived as temporary. It was perceived as a reaction. It was perceived as something that will pass, after which the Russian Democrats will come to power. And of course, Navalny was one of the biggest candidates to it. Right. So I guess I underestimated the level of, how strong these sentiments were. And the most important part, not how strong they were per se, but the political kind of part of it, right? Political meaning and political charge of that same Soviet nostalgia to which I myself was part and which I also reproduced.
Interesting. I mean, given that you studied psychology and all of that, one of the things that I'm most interested in psychology, it's something that isn't talked about a lot, is social identity theory, which I'm sure you're aware of. I saw it very much when I grew up because I used to do sports, and my best friend, one of my three best friends, we were on opposing teams in sports when I was younger, and we sometimes competed against one another. And off when we weren't doing sports, we were really good friends. But as soon as we played against one another, we were enemies. So from what I can gather from what you're saying here is what it seems to me is that there is something in Soviet times, in Russian times, that creates this kind of attachment to Soviet Union, to Russia, that you start viewing it as part of your identity. And when something becomes part of your identity, then it becomes like a sports team that you're attached to, that you defend. And you see these kinds of things all the time. But this is something that has always fascinated me a lot, because you see it everywhere all the times. People are being extremely tribal. They're basically just defending their own team, because that's how I think about it. It's just team sports where people who grew up in a particular country will defend things because they are part of that country. Because if they were to start criticizing things from their own country, their community might say, "You're not one of us anymore," ostracized. And so this is one of the things that makes it so tricky, because I think people often ask themselves, and I asked you also before, why do Russians not do more? And I think this is one of the things that explains a lot of that, because if some of these people had another community, like you live in the United States now, you have other people that you belong to, you have another community now, so it makes things much easier for people to criticize something, because they have somewhere else to go. But if you don't also have somewhere else to go, um things a lot of people will most likely defend even the indefensible. That's kind of how I think about it. Do you have any thought about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you are very right, and it's very real. And you're absolutely right in saying that part of that attachment becomes your own identity. And it's extremely painful to part with that part of identity. It's you're tearing it out of yourself with blood. It's not a bloodless process. It's a process full of inner conflict. And you're absolutely right also that there is a huge pressure from society and from your friends, from your relatives, from your anything that you can have surrounded with, right? You're being surrounded with, and this process, unfortunately, for me, it also kind of was accompanied by all these ruptures, by the inner ruptures and by the ruptures with the family, with the friends. And it is much easier to do it if you have support from others. And for me in particular, the biggest part of support, as I said, was my community in Ukraine, even though I didn't even maintain that many ties to them after 2013 when I was last time there. Nevertheless, that was a life-saving support, first of all. And the second of all is that I must say that even though I've been living in the US for a long time, I'm not a citizen of the United States, and I don't really feel like I became truly a part of the society here in the way that, of course, I feel accepted and appreciated, but I didn't commit yet to the future of the United States in that sense, because I don't have the same stakes here as citizens have. And I have a lot of doubt and a lot of inner distance from what the current Trump administration is doing. And I had it since he first came to power, which was 2006. So to me, even though I did overcome a lot of stereotypes within myself about the West, I still am very skeptical about some of the parts of the US society, for example, and I look at them with a great distrust. And I don't think that they are my friends or my, community, or like I can share with them a lot of things because I really can't. And I don't feel like they feel like I am their own either, with all the anti-immigrant sentiments that are in the US so prominent right now. I feel like our relationships right now are very much like, um, I for example, do think that it's entirely possible that Trump and Putin align at some point more than they do. I hope it doesn't happen, and I really feel like Ukrainians will convince Trump of support far more than he's supporting Ukraine now. But it's entirely possible that there is a full alignment between Russia and the US as well, in which case, of course, my personal fate is not enviable. I can also be deported, for example, which things like that do happen to Russians, as you know. So I understand that this is a very fraught position, but I also tell myself that a lot of people lost in this war far, far, far more than I ever would, and so I just don't feel like being silent about it.
Yeah. No, I hear you. That sounds very bleak. It's hard to not sympathize with you. I, I would probably I would push back slightly. I don't think it's quite as bleak as you think. I would say that there is guy writing for something called the Dispatch. His name is Jonah Goldberg. I heard him make an analogy to Trump and how he treats his allies that I think was very, very accurate. He said that Trump grew up in New York, uh, and there was a lot of organized crime in New York. And because he grew up in this kind of environment, he views um, allies the way the Italian mob views other families and their own family, where the heads of other families from other with other last names, they are treated with respect because they are people ahead of their own families, whereas his own family he treats with contempt because they aren't doing enough for him. So that's how I think he sees the Western world. They are weak. They are not showing him enough respect. They're trying to rip him and the United States off at every chance they get. Whereas the heads of other families, Xi Jinping, China, Putin, etc., they are treated with respect because they are head of their families. So I also think that there is a lot of uh, there's a lot of actors right now in the American political scene where they are doing their best to play along with the Trumpian way, where up is down, good is bad, etc. But I do think that even, I mean, this is maybe I'm too optimistic. It could be the case, but I do think that someone like J.D. Vance, who was a never Trumper in 2016 and said all these bad things about Trump, I don't think, I don't think he actually he knows who Trump is. But in order to have a political future, you have to play along with Trump. Same with Marco Rubio, extremely critical of Trump, actually pro-Ukrainian. I align with him when it comes to foreign policy in many ways in general. But because he's part of the Trump administration, and this is his job, he has to play this part. So I think that once you approach 2028, the next election, you will see an avalanche of people distancing themselves from Trump, trying to um, play along with whatever is coming next. Unfortunately, for the rest of the world and also for people in the United States, it has exposed something deeply corrupt within the United States, which is that there is a lot of people who will turn on their values if it benefits them. And that I find very scary. And I never thought that a country like the United States, that I have looked up to for much of my life, or can have such corrupt people in it that will do things if it benefits them in a way that I don't see the same to the same extent in other Western countries. That I think is very bad. But I don't know. I don't think that there is this kind of alignment with Trump and Putin. I think Trump is transactional. I think Putin has surely said that if you put some pressure on Ukraine, then once the war is over, you will have the Trump Tower in Moscow, or you'll have a bunch of deals, or something like that. He knows exactly how to play Trump, so he will give him the best deal you possibly could have in terms of how it can benefit Trump.
Yeah.
So yeah. So that's kind of my thoughts. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm totally with you on that idea that it is scary how many people are able to compromise on their morals for power, right? And J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, who were critics of Trump, became kind of his supporters when they kind of felt that he's actually loved by the American people and he's supported by the American people. So I definitely felt a lot of disappointment and frustration when Trump especially came to power the second time, because, you know, it's the first time it can be charted on some sort of, it's also very unpleasant, but it's at least it can be charted off on a number of circumstances, like things so happened. But when it happens the second time, then you realize that there are so much deeper issues in play, right? And he really is appealing to so many people with his ideology, and they are supporting him fully, and even willing to compromise, as you put it, right, on their own values. So I do think, however, that Trump is not Putin's asset, and what Putin's, has some sort of compromise on Trump that we don't already know about. And I really think that Trump is his own independent person. And of course, he has a lot of like flaws, like he's extremely, let's say, vain, right? And he is very greedy, and he wants this all sorts of praise, and he's very much interested in being lauded as the leader, and so on and so on. But I think what worse that is happening, the worst part is that Trump is mimicking Putin in this same imperial rhetoric. And apparently in the US, despite the years of decolonization, also this idea of the US as a colonial power that needs more land is also prominent. And we hear Trump wanting to occupy Canada or annex Canada, having it as a 51st state, and Greenland, that the US supposedly needs Greenland so much. So I feel like this is a copy paste of Putin's modus operandi, that's an aggression, of course. And in this case, I would say that the role of the European Union then becomes very important, right? In this overall kind of architecture of the world security. What do you think?
I mean, yeah, I think that the way, because it benefits Russia, they think about things in terms of spheres of influence. Are you aware what that is?
Yeah, sure. It's
Yeah.
a very common term that is used, and it kind of meets a lot of understanding in the West, right? All the appeals, Russian appeals to its sphere of influence, are given a lot of credence.
Yes, exactly. So that is exactly what I think Trump is doing right now. He's calling it the Don Row doctrine, uh, so that he wants to control the South America, Central America, Greenland. That's his sphere of influence, whereas Russia's is Europe, China's is Taiwan, and it's because it benefits them all. They can prosper, make themselves prosper, and the people around them can prosper at the cost of a lot of other people. But it doesn't matter to them because no one's going to hold them accountable, so they can get away with these things. So I agree with you on that. But it's also extremely transactional. It's if I do this for you, you do this for me, and then they have this kind of understanding between them that they don't. They don't mess around with each other's business. I think this is basically the kind of understanding that Trump and Putin have, that uh, while I mean it's I don't think it's that simple either, because it's true that United States does things for Ukraine still. It looks like they are trying to remove themselves from supporting Ukraine. Um, but I'm not sure exactly why they have supported Ukraine so much up until this point, if this is all there is to it. So I think it's a little bit more complicated, but it seems to be moving towards that direction. But why it's delayed, I'm not really sure why that is. But it's interesting to me how United States is becoming something more like Russia, and it is scary. But I do think that once Trump is out of office, I mean, I can see United States also becoming worse. There is some people now on the left side of the political spectrum that are almost, I mean, not entirely like MAGA, but they also would want United States to isolate themselves from the world, and they in some ways also buy into the Russian narrative that the war in Ukraine started because of NATO, blaming the United States. It's rather than America first, it's blame America first. That's kind of how I see it, and I find it really scary. And I don't understand the Americans who think like this, because they are United States is a superpower precisely because of its military and economy, cultural influence. If you start removing some of this influence, other things will follow with it. It's not just gonna, you can't just remove some part of this and have all the other good things from it. It doesn't work like that. So I don't understand it, and it's such a big mistake. But I also think that I am someone who reads a lot about Ukraine, so I care much about this. And I also think that it creates a little bit of an echo chamber where, because I'm so into everything that's happening now, it's hard to uh, have a real good assessment of whether this is something that's, is this the worst possible thing that can happen, or is it reasonable that this can happen? It's really hard to evaluate, I must say. So I try to stay a little bit more optimistic, even though I would say the evidence points to the other direction, that I should be less optimistic. But yeah.
Well, I'm very optimistic. I personally think that Ukraine continues convincing the US that it needs to support Ukraine and has achieved a lot of successes. For example, probably Laura Loomer flipping to Ukraine side is one of the more interesting sort of media parts of it. So I feel like, and also, from that meeting in Oval Office between Trump and Zelensky that ended in disaster, to the photos when they both smile on the scene with the flags of the United States and Ukraine. It's also a great trajectory that very few are able to achieve in general. So it shows us that Ukraine did not give up on the United States, despite that Trump kind of came to power on the promise that, of course, he came to power on the promise that he will end this war in 3 days, which was nonsense. And on the statement that if he was president, that the war wouldn't have started, which is also nonsense. But the thing is that Ukraine didn't give up. It continues this conversation. And so I think we cannot give up on the US as well. Now, I agree with you that the left in the US has been a huge disappointment because they have been literally saying all these things about proxy war and how NATO is this imperial project, and they refuse to see that the Russian project is also colonial and it's a project of land grab and genocide right now towards Ukraine. And so, yes, the left is a problem. However, the left is also not in power. Apparently, the Biden administration had the vision of the United States as a protector of certain international laws and things like that, right? So it felt that it's important to project that power, I guess, together with the European Union towards Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea, and whoever else is, within that area of what Russia imagines to be multipolar world. But Trump administration selected a different direction, and this different direction was that this is not our war. We have to pull back. Europe has to take on and file that gap. But I completely agree with you that it's not possible to pull away and expect that Europe will still recognize the United States as an ally to the same degree, or that the United States can project its cultural supremacy over some regions that it was able to project if it pulls away kind of militarily. So my guess is that we will have to continue hoping that something will change in the US, as you said, in 2028. I don't know how much hope we can really harbor realistically about it, but I'm with you on hoping that it will be the case that we will see something significantly different towards what we see now.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think from Ukraine's own perspective, you can never give up hope on the United States because it's a military force that it would be unwise to give up on it because always, no matter what, trying to get the United States on your side, obviously that's gonna be the way forward, and that's clearly what Zelensky is doing himself and the people around him. So, and I think that when I think about my perspective, and then I think about from a Ukrainian perspective, sometimes I think in this case I do think that I probably should. I don't know. I mean, obviously, I'm just a very small account on Twitter that no one listens to or has any influence. But if I was someone who had bigger following, I know I would change my tune a little bit. I would try to be optimistic about this because Ukrainian government is. So you don't want all of its supporters to just shit talk the United States, no matter how disappointing they are, because that's what the Ukrainian government is signaling, that don't give up. We have to convince the United States to be on our side. They have things that no one else has. And the way to protect Ukraine is by the Patriot system, for example. So there are ways that United States, you cannot give up on the United States because there are just things that Ukraine needs that cannot be met from anyone else. So yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree. It's interesting that you're talking about changing your messaging if you were a bigger account. Maybe you have to change your messaging and see if that is making you a bigger account in that sense. So it's very interesting how it works. What do you think?
I mean, I'm someone who I'm just here because I care about so many different parts here.
Mm.
First, it's one of the most binary conflicts I've ever come across, the war in Ukraine. It is so binary. Russia is bad, Ukraine is good. It's just simple. And then um, also, I think the West is overall a good force, and it's siding with Ukraine. That is in the right here. So it's one of these cases where uh, West isn't doing anything bad. This is something I entirely support because this is we're not going to war in Iraq or something like that. This is supporting Ukraine. This is obvious. So yeah, it's but I'm not aiming to become a big person in these spaces. I also think that anything that I have to say isn't unique in any way. I don't have a perspective that there aren't 50 other people out there that can articulate whatever I think
I
way
think
better
it's
than I do.
extremely important that we without our unique perspectives support Ukraine. I feel like this is extremely important, and we don't need to be super original or like mind breaking or breaking the narratives. We just have to continue doing it and continue supporting Ukraine.
Yeah, I agree. I'm just never gonna be a big account that I'm not even aiming for it. I'm more interested in spreading things that I like from others, liking their content, retweeting their content, things like that. Sometimes commenting just to give them more clout because I'm not at all important here. So yeah, it's better that that those
It's
who are
very
already.
modest. It's very modest of you to position yourself this way. I think it's great that Ukraine, of course, is able to amass such following precisely because it represents like real people who do not necessarily want to become, a loudspeaker for some ideas, for example, right? We are private individuals. We just want to support what we feel is right. And I think there is a great power in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Johan, thank you so much for giving us the space. It was a great idea, I think, to discuss these things. And I'm hoping that perhaps we can continue this conversation too.
We should also invite other people, but I
Yeah,
certainly agree.
that would be a
I
great idea.
yeah, we should invite more people. I think this should be this is a way for more people to have their voices heard and because I think that there's the NAFO for sure, but I think that I don't hear many of these people actually talk. I wish more of these people made themselves heard. Um, having so I'm on this app called Clubhouse a lot. It's completely drowned. The war in Ukraine is completely. It has almost no. Um, it has no voice whatsoever there. It's
Mhm.
all religion, philosophy, or Israel Palestine.
I see.
So
I hear you
yeah,
there. Yeah,
yeah,
we will continue doing that. And
definitely.
yeah, thank you so much. And I appreciate talking to you.
Same here. Let's do it again.
All
All
right.
right.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.